Hi, everybody. My name is Hasti Soltani. I'm the Adult Programs Manager at MCA Denver. Welcome to the final installment of our open source program series. For these programs, we asked our wonderful and creative MCA community to propose their most exciting and interesting ideas for MCA programs, and all of these 3 programs have been the result of that process. All of MCA Denver's programs this season have been offered online for free. If you have the means and would like to support us financially, please consider making a donation at mcadenver.org/support. Any donation amount is welcome and is greatly appreciated. Today, we are so excited to round out our open source series with Diagramming Sentences, a program proposed by Talty and Steuart Bremner, and I'm so thrilled to introduce them both to you. Talty and Steuart Bremner have been working together on public sculpture, temporary environmental installations, and handmade book projects since the 1990s. Bremner received his BFA from the University of Colorado at Boulder at the same time Talty was graduating with the same degree from the University of Denver. They met at Summervale Art Workshop. Permanent public sculptures by Bremner and Talty can be found in Frisco, Breckenridge, and Aspen in Colorado, as well as in Italy and Luxembourg. Evidence of their temporary works remain in photographs and online, but originally were placed in contemplative settings where they were encountered by chance and not by buying a ticket to a museum. Most recently, they have chosen their audience to be those who go to art museums, and have made one-of-a-kind books that they leave in art museum bookstores. They've left a series of books in the UK, New Orleans, Los Angeles, and the Northwest, and in each series they include an essay about contemporary art making. Please join me in welcoming Terry and Steuart. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks. All right, so thanks, Hasti, and thanks for the MCA. So how did we get diagrams into our sentence diagrams in our work? Hasti told you about some of the different projects we've done, and so we do this democratic public art that's available when it's set up. A lot of it's temporary. And then over time, we did more public and free work that was on the internet. And again, this is with lines and text, and on the right-hand side of your screen is the code that you don't see, and on the left-hand side is this piece that we put together of NFL scores. So you have to go in the back end to find any real details. But it's about layering and what things look like. This is another piece that we did from the much too much information series.
Yeah, and which is what I love about the football scores is you can't really read them. We get plenty of information about that, and we don't. It's nice to just have them obliterated.
And with this, these were polls that were leading up to the 2016 election. Our new project has been making these books. And we've begun public art that we can do by ourselves, and it's an intimate public art. So we make these books at a scale that's great for drawings and reading, and it's a twist on public art in that you can take it home. So we leave it in the public, but then we hope that they become acquired and they get taken away. And the books are made in sections. The printed section explains that you can take this book, it doesn't belong here. If you're interested in it, walk away with this. And there's also sections of drawings, and I think the drawings a little bit relate to sentence diagramming structure, but that's just by chance.
And Steuart sits and draws each drawing, about a group of about 10 in each book.
And the final section of the book, we handwrite and do drawings at the museum we're dropping it off at, or talking about it, sort of a travel journal. This one, Terry's in Dublin, and this is moments before we closed the book and went and slipped it into the bookstore. And so we've done 16 books over 3 years, and they've been taken, and they've also been negotiated, which we didn't really expect. Someone would wait in line and talk to a clerk and say, look, I found this book, or, it says I can take it, should I take it? And of course, they end up calling the manager to find out what they can do, but they get the book. So meanwhile, Terry and some poet friends were starting to do on the internet works with diagramming and with the Mueller report. And the idea is to slow you down, to look at these dense documents and see if you can, read these. And so they have started appearing in the books. And so they kind of, opposite to the other work we're doing on the internet, these clarify the craziness around us today, the rhetoric that we hear in politics. And so this is a clarification and a slowdown. And you can hold this book and read this thing and wonder, why was this in here? And this is another one from the books. This was a long sentence with a sort of a double spread. And that's how we ended up sentence diagramming.
Yeah, we maybe just trying to trick people into actually reading more of the Mueller report.
So let's meet the panel.
Yeah, we wanted to let everybody introduce themselves. And I'm going to say, please feel free to say how you learned how to sentence diagram. The panel is purposely made up of different types of thinkers, and Max McKenna is representing kind of the poetry world. Max?
Thanks, Terry and Steuart, and thanks, Hasti. I'm really excited to be here. Right, as Terry started to say, I'm here in the capacity of representing poetry, literature more broadly. So my name is Max McKenna. I am a teaching assistant for a free online poetry course offered through the University of Pennsylvania. It's called ModPo, which is short for Modern and Contemporary American Poetry. So I'm hoping to bring this sort of literary lens to these diagrams to talk a bit about the semantics and also the potential poetic quality of some of these diagrams. So to give everybody a little flavor of my approach, I wanted to diagram a poem. And the poem I chose, which is up here on the screen now, is The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. Some of you might be familiar with this poem. It's widely anthologized. So this poem on first glance looks like a kind of modernist provocation. It's a poem that's seemingly about nothing. It's radically untraditional. There's no rhyme scheme. The lines are quite short. It's a very visually striking poem. But the way that we talk about this poem in ModPo is to talk about, because this is one of the poems we talk about in ModPo, the way that we talk about this is to talk about the philosophy of language that this poem seems to be advancing, which is a philosophy of language that's really based on this keyword depends. So in this poem, we see the way that language depends or hangs down. So using a kind of archaic meaning of the word depends, we see the way that language kind of hangs off of itself. So this poem is gradually accruing bits and pieces. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. So this vertical form is one where the parts of speech are hanging from each other, almost like a chain, which help this image, this rural image, come into clearer focus. So this idea of language depending on itself, I think, is revealed in the process of diagramming a sentence. So of course, I went ahead and diagrammed this poem, which is conveniently a single sentence. And I think that this diagram, it's neat because the poem already sort of diagrams itself by breaking itself down into its constituent parts in this vertical way. So doing the diagram, you have a similar effect horizontally. And I think you can really see the point that this poem is trying to make, the idea that the subject so much is gathering so much bits and pieces of language around itself, this kind of constellation. So there's this unique capacity for language to accrue more language around itself, which is what makes every utterance so unique. And so you kind of almost get the sense that this poem could continue. It could continue to gather more and more bits and pieces, more and more clauses to make an even richer image. So that's one reading of this poem, and it's I think really compelling for thinking about sentence diagrams, that's why I wanted to bring it up here.
Yeah, that's great, Max. You can just see that you ran out of space at the end of the
I did.
what probably William Carlos Williams did too. That's enough right there. That's enough. Perfect.
Right. It's the page is that's an interesting limitation, I think.
No, that was fun. And so Chris Chiari is our representative from the world of politics. Chris?
Thank you. I am a multi-time political candidate. I've run for office in 2 states. Political messaging is all about nuance, brevity, impact. You're seeing a slide now. I'm currently am the owner of Patterson Inn, a small 9-room hotel here in Denver, Colorado. On 11th, please come visit. The house has been there since 1891. I'm the caretaker of this beautiful old estate that by and large is still intact as far as the internal woodwork. I love sharing the history and doing my part to preserve this structure for longevity. 128 years old, and it'll hopefully be there in another 128 years. I'm also a filmmaker. I recently released a documentary on the war on drugs called Public Enemy Number One with Ice-T and a young director named Robert Ripberger, originally in Boulder. Film was broadly released digitally, thanks to the COVID world, back on June 9th. So Amazon Prime, Hulu, any of the digital sources should be on streaming, hopefully by this fall or definitely by winter. This is our poster for the film, executive produced by Ice-T, joined near the end, right as we were about to premiere the film, but gave us that punch that we really needed because he has so much firsthand experience with friends and entertainers and other performers that have been impacted by the war on drugs from every level of his sphere of influence and community. So the film really dug into the realities around the war on drugs, the over-militarization of police that was a product of seizing of assets, the product of quotas that were rewarded at the federal level, both with overtime, with staffing, as well as literal grants to local police departments, state police departments across the nation at different levels of escalation in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And this war on drugs, which at its root core was a war on people, and it was a war on Black people, and it was a war on thought from the left that was considered the opposition of the leadership at the time. I welcome you to please take a look. Public Enemy Number One. Also, the website is pinofilm.com. So thank you for letting me be here. I'm looking forward from this idea of finding that nuance in language, finding that impact and punch, parsing the words down, either with intended meaning or sometimes implied meaning. I know one of the sentences we're going to look at is from the Republican talking points from 2016, and I'm excited to dig into that sentence because I think it revealed a lot, both of a thought process at the time as well as maybe a sneak of what was to come with their own leadership and leadership style.
Great. Our next panelist is Joel Swanson. He's a visual artist and he also works with digital media.
Hi, and thanks for having me. Yes, I'm an artist and writer working with language and technology. I'm an assistant professor in the Atlas Institute at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I teach anything from creative programming to experimental typography. To introduce myself and my work, I'll just show you a few slides of some recent projects. I like to take kind of simple words and concepts and break them down until their underlying power kind of exhibits itself. So this is a piece off the 16th Street Mall in an alleyway where the Y of yours blinks on and off. So questioning this notion of what is yours, what is ours, and who kind of owns these liminal spaces. I also did a public work over at the Bourne Hotel. It's kind of a word grid of the word there, but again, without kind of a point of origin, it becomes here, there, the, again, trying to make these simple concepts a little more complex through recontextualization. I also do some technology-based work. This is I think, a kind of fun work that was shown in Ireland last year, what happens is it chooses a word randomly on the left, and then a spelling deformation algorithm will intentionally misspell that word on the right, and then a spelling correction algorithm will respell it correctly on the left, and they keep trading it off like ping pong, kind of deforming it on the right, correcting on the left, creating this odd concrete poetry that's generated by these fighting or dueling algorithms, making this kind of commentary on our relationship to mistake making and technology. Also did this piece, which was designed for the clock tower in downtown Denver. It's a projection mapping piece using purely typographic symbols. So it took all the basic punctuation marks like asterisks and periods and commas and semicolons and tried to create these various animations or choreographies that in some way connected to the implicit meaning behind these symbols. Also like to play with binaries a lot, because so much of our language, especially English, is rooted in these problematic binaries. So this piece is called Binary Pronouns, and it posits kind of this red channel, blue channel, anaglyph technology, 3D technology. But within it, it's positing these very powerful binaries like us versus them, yours versus ours, he versus she. Again, a lot of these problematic binaries that we can really trace to the core of conflict within our world today. I'll skip a couple for the sake of time. This is a piece where I involved my parents. I had them both record themselves saying the famous childhood phrase, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," which I think is patently absurd. We all know words have a lot of power to hurt, to injure. And so I wanted to silence that phrase. So I had them record themselves speaking it, and then I 3D printed the waveform. So I took the waveform and revolved it around its baseline, creating these volumetric sculptures. My father's voice on the left, my mother's on the right. I found this interesting idea of taking a phrase that I find problematic and silencing it by making it a sculpture was kind of this interesting artistic move. Recently, I've been exploring my childhood and the ways I learned English. And one of the primary ways I learned English was through breakfast cereal. So I got a box of breakfast cereal, and this is alphabets, and I pulled out all the bits of cereal that weren't actually letters, or somehow they were deformed through this process of mass production. And then I cast the unrecognizable letter forms in lead, kind of creating this connection between graphite and lead that's in pencils, but also the lead that's found in matrices in the printing press. But also there's an irony in that the form came from a breakfast cereal, making these like forms inedible. So in a way, making a toxic, unintelligible language, if you will. But I gather the reason I am here is because of a piece I did, almost a decade ago for the first time. And that's when I took Saul Lewitt's Sentences on Conceptual Art, a very famous essay that I had to read in grad school. And I diagrammed it using the basic rules of sentence diagramming. What I decided to do with this was to remove the words, so to just kind of purely use the form that the language created, which I thought was kind of this interesting conceptual move that related to formalism and form making. So to give you a sense of the essay, I pulled out the first 5 of 35 sentences, and they're these aphoristic, curious thoughts about the nature and process of conceptual art, like conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach. Or rational judgments repeat rational judgments. Or number 4, formal art is essentially rational. Again, these kind of heady phrases that you could kind of think about for a long time. And I posted a link there if you'd like to read the entire essay, or you can just Google the title. So this is what I did with it. I plotted them out, and they go from left to right in about 4 different rows. And here's kind of a faded out picture. I like the idea that the forms are very light visually, so you really were just looking at the shadow of the sentences on the wall. Again, trying to make this connection between writing and kind of the ephemerality of speech and language and the way that relates to form. But to kind of zoom in on one, here is 10A, which is ideas can be works of art. And the way I diagrammed it is ideas is the subject, can be is the verb, with can being the modal auxiliary verb. works being the predicate nominative, and then of art being a prepositional phrase that modifies works. So yeah, I'm coming at this conversation from a perspective of conceptual art and art making, and thinking about ways that we can use language and the rules of language as a way to be critical of the inherent power behind words.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I asked you, you learned anything more about Solowitz's piece by doing this diagramming?
I did. And a curious thing that I was thinking about when you asked me that question was, it got me thinking about the actual process, the process of learning how to diagram in elementary school, and the way that this notion of the rules of grammar and proper English are deployed. And I went to a very racially diverse elementary school, and I remember that the way people spoke and the way people read and write was really kind of problematically categorized based off of, well, you're not speaking the right way, right? So I'm coming at this really from a perspective of what I learned is that these rules of grammar and even sentence diagramming are the tools that we use to enforce kind of proper English. Who gets to say what is proper? And so and especially with, you know, recent movements in the world, I think that notion of proper English and what is correct and normal is something that I'm becoming increasingly critical of. So that's kind of
yeah. I think Max will back me up on this, but in ModPo, we definitely, no one has a right way to interpret a poem. And
right.
We really love the poems that are open and let us interpret them any way we want.
Yeah, and that's what I learned too, is that there are many instances when you are diagramming, and there could be 2 to 3 correct ways to diagram it. There's actually some variation with complex language where there is no right answer, which I find refreshing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, now Susan Helly is a English teacher and tutor, and so she's representing kind of the educational department.
Hi, thank you for having me. And I guess ironically enough, probably I'm the least, conventional about diagramming. I think that probably I diagrammed sentences when I was in 7th grade and learned correct grammar very well. And then since then, I have to say, when my approach to teaching language and to my own reading and kind of experience of language is that it's just that, it's an experience, and that language acts upon us. It isn't that, you know, it isn't here's the reader and here's the text. It's a dynamic process, and that language itself is dynamic. And that when I see it in a diagram, to me, that seems incredibly static. And so when I look at language, a passage or a sentence, I see it more as almost like hypertext, and things start kind of bouncing out at me, things that I notice in terms of patterning or the effect of certain things. I mean, and I think that's the whole thing is I guess, how does language function? And what is the effect on the reader or the listener? And that is why I think it's a more living, dynamic process. And so when I look at a passage or a sentence, I consider things just like you would when you look at a painting, you would, or a piece of music, the size. So is it a minuet or an opera? Is it a you know, huge Clifford Still canvas, or is it a little, you know, Picasso pen and ink or something? So I look at the white space, because I think that definitely has an impression on us, and sentences and the density of a passage. Also, just similarly to a canvas, have a certain effect on us. Cadence is really, really important. The rhythm and just the beat of the language itself. Punctuation can have a tremendous effect on whether it's a pause or sometimes intentionally no punctuation to keep things flowing and almost like a freight train. The weight, certain words have different weight and texture, and some of them you can kind of grab onto and you feel the weight of them yourself. They're very freighted, and some of them are much lighter and you know, might give that feeling of kind of a feeling of lift or something. And those are the diction choices. Balance is something I think that even is cultural, because we think about a lot of the language, when we go back to the Greek orators, and we look at the terms of, animatably, and we've got antithesis and things like that, and then the study of oration. And so, even when you think about like the English garden, it's very balanced. It's got the topiary tree on each side and things like that. And then we look at the kind of, when people first came to America, it was more like the brambles and the kind of rough in the woods and the frontier. But then you think about the Japanese garden, and that's an aesthetic in their writing as well, which is, the asymmetry. And so I would say lots of times in American language, American oratory, we listen for those schemes of balance and parallelism. The language used for comparison, contrast, cacophony. So that's if it's harsh sounding language, or euphony. So I hear a sentence in my head at the same time as I read it. This is an example from Malcolm X. And we've got the subject, and we see a total different energy in the first half of the sentence and the second half of the sentence. And this is why I talk about it as being dynamic. The pronouns kind of bookend the sentence, we and us. And then we've got, did land as the verb with not as the adverb. And then on Plymouth Rock, and landing kind of has, land, the verb there has kind of a more, again, dynamic and a lighter quality. But when we do what's called animatably, and actually reverse it, we just look at the function, the feel of that. Plymouth Rock and the consonants that goes along with rock landed on us. We feel the thud of Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrim's Landing and the weight of that whole experience when we look at that. So language can and should, I think, be used in a really dynamic way. And there's an eloquence that we can work to create. And that's something that I've worked as a teacher, is to teach kids style and how to make their own, first of all, how to think and how to use their own thoughts and how to articulate them. So I happened to be reading this novel when Terry spoke to me about doing this program, and that and the first quote I had on there were so relevant to what we were talking about, and just this whole idea of eloquence in language. And I know that I don't think that has to be a classist issue. I don't think there is a one right way of, formal English and not formal English. There can be an eloquence in, rap music. So, but I think that idea that language and sentences and words act upon us and they function to do so and to figure out how they work is important to me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So we're going to diagram the first sentence, and I thought, Chris, maybe you could explain, this is from the current Republican platform, and maybe you could explain what a platform is and what happened in 2020 to the Republicans.
Party platforms are the basic beliefs of the collective body of the delegates for the respective parties at their annual conventions every 4 years that can seem to that overlap with the presidential election. What was interesting this year is the Republican Party didn't change their platform. They simply readopted the same platform from 2016, and if anything, added now that they're the party in incumbency, their full-hearted support of the current administration. But by keeping the platform from 2016, it almost becomes a snapshot in time, because in hindsight, reading it today, the meaning is dramatically different and is applicable to both moments in history, both from the original intent. When you see the sentence, it's written with the intention of stigmatizing or criticizing the administration at that time, which was the Obama administration. But when you read it today, in 2020, it almost seems foreshadowing about who we are and where we've come over the last 4 years. And so the power of language to make a point at one time for the circumstances of history to change, and yet for the same sentence to be equally as relevant today as it was then. But again, when we look at it up close and when you read it, our standing in world affairs has declined significantly. Our enemies no longer fear us. Our friends no longer trust us. a statement to criticize what was then the Obama-Biden administration, but by many measures and for many Americans looking at our standing today, was this not foreshadowing? Again, just fascinating, the power of words, the thought and nuance that went in, because these words were picked by a collective committee to extract their collective belief. And then again, here we are 4 years later, and equally as relevant, but from almost 180 degrees.
Right, and today we can say, I mean, whose fault is it that this occurs? What's everybody's like first take on this when you see this? You know, the way I chose it, and I definitely did kind of take a little liberty here. But what's your first impression when you see the sentence? Is it like if it was a Rorschach test, what would you say to the psychiatrist?
Like visually, it's kind of like a bullet almost. In
Yeah. Chris, did you get a first impression?
I like that, Steuart. You're right. I mean, it's just the shape of a bullet.
I kind of see the loaded language there. You know, we've got the weighted words that has to define our standing, enemies, and friends. So we've got all the nouns. But that whole idea of no longer repeated twice. So no longer fear us and no longer trust us. That sets up kind of this whole tone of trepidation that used to be that way, and now it isn't. And so there's a fear, trepidation is created by using no longer, instead of like, don't fear us, but no, they no longer, we had it and we've lost it. And I think that's a really important thing in terms of the momentum of the ideas, is that we've transitioned, it's declined. There's that whole momentum of declining and no longer.
I'm struck by the symmetry. I mean, as Susan pointed out, we have no longer repeated here. And I think this really stands out, especially in this kind of diagram that you've done, Terry. The repetition of hour, we have those 3 hours like that. There's so much symmetry in this diagram and in this sentence. I think that's part of its rhetorical thrust.
Well, actually, can you put that slide 6 up, Steuart? Because that's kind of how I looked at it when I saw it.
Which?
Oh, my slide 6.
Sure.
See, so that's exactly how I thought.
Mm.
The hour. Yeah. Building this whole common ground. And then the 3 nouns, standing, enemies, and friends. And then we've got that whole, again, just like the hypertext has declined, fear us, trust, and then the us at the end too. And so I saw it very, very, I started looking at the patterns start kind of acting upon me.
Yeah, it looks like the poem. The next.
Yeah, it does.
Well, and I'm drawn to the pronouns, right? Our, us. Yeah, who gets to say who? Our, yours, us, them. I mean, the way that these simple pronouns are deployed is, this is rhetoric. This is like rhetoric 101, but it's still pretty powerful.
And what was the writer's intention? What picture were they trying to give us?
It's certainly a sentence made to draw harsh lines. This is about saying us versus them. We have friends and we have enemies, and the knowledge of who's who is implicit when it's not. So I'm seeing lots of very direct language that's meant to polarize here, that's meant to divide people into groups.
And to create fear.
Yeah.
Create fear, the whole tone of that.
Well, Max, I think you said to me the whole thing feels hostile to you.
Can you repeat that, Terry? Sorry, I cut out for a second.
I think you said the whole piece felt hostile to you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's Susan was getting at that a little bit with the no longer. Um, the no longer is an interesting turn of phrase. I think that really ups the us and them feel, the idea that there's a decline, right? Which is of course the verb in the main clause here. I like the idea of it being a bullet shape. It's strangely sharp looking, and that symmetry too, as I mentioned earlier. I think that there's something there's always something that's kind of intimidating about symmetry, I find, and geometric symmetry lines like that I think is kind of, it's always sort of intense.
Yeah, that's great. That symmetry is intimidating. Just the idea of our faces are not exactly similar, symmetrical, and that we found that the people that are most symmetrical are what we find as beautiful, even though maybe that's plain. That's a really interesting idea, Max. That's symmetry.
I think so many powerful symbols we'd all be familiar with. A number of them are always playing with symmetry, whether they're symmetrical or they're just slightly asymmetrical in a very intentional way. And I think that this has a similar effect that we can really see in this diagram.
But is that Western thought? Because you think of asymmetry as being such an important value in Eastern design.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, of course, you're right. We're bringing some of our context, Western context to this, of course.
Well, and Joel, you did a whole series of work on that ampersand, which is not symmetrical, and yet that's joining.
Yes. Despite, I think, my inherent propensity to want to put things in neat little boxes, I'm learning as I get older that life is more about and the complexity about and-ness versus kind of or.
Yeah, and it isn't the ampersand. Oh, I don't know where the screen is. So let's go. Should we take a look at the second sentence, which is from the Democratic platform for 2020, written this year. So Hasti, do you have sentence number 2? Much different structure. Yeah, so just a way more fluid. And of course, I like the idea that to build back better, which is their new slogan, that it all comes off of the build. You get these 3, this alliteration bumps, it descends from itself. Each one descends from the previous one. Any first impressions of an image, if it was your Rorschach test?
It sounds like building. It's like the hammer punching in the nails, the consonants of to build back better. It works on a really auditory level.
The structure is certainly more complex, which makes me think of just this propensity for all complex diagrams to kind of run downhill. And I don't mean downhill in any negative sense, right? But there is this kind of natural just kind of motion for sense diagrams to keep building right and down, which is not strange given the fact that we read left to right, top to bottom. But that's something that was problematic for me when I was doing the Solowit piece was how do you place these things on a wall that are always going to run into each other? Just that kind of downhill flow of words and language, especially in these more complex and nuanced kind of statements, was an interesting thing to work with.
Yeah, so it's, I think, similar to what Max was saying about the wheelbarrow poem, that the subject is there And then we're really talking about the subject. So that's some of the reason that we keep adding more to it. We keep fancying up the image, and we even made this image really, the subject is a complicated thing to start with. It's not just, the wheelbarrow, it's containing the pandemic.
Mm. That is a very complex subject. But I'm thinking, I wanted to make a comment about the predicate, this interesting compound predicate that we have. So right, Terry, as you said, this, like most of these diagrams are in conversation with that, potentially in conversation with the William Carlos Williams poem I discussed at the beginning, because you can see, especially in political speech, how important adjectives are and loading in the adjectives. But there also seems to be this profound rhetorical move here, or kind of awareness that happens, where this first clause, to repair the damage Trump has done and so forth, is there's a lot going on there. And so in order to have this almost 1-2 punch, they button it at the end with this very short clause of "to build back better." Instead of a whole other polemic or accusation. It's this very punchy, short little button to the end. And I think here we actually see this is interesting compared to the other sentence we were reading, because we see an asymmetry happening here, I think, where these clauses are very purposefully lopsided.
Yeah, that's really great. That it's almost like a button, a little bit of the duck flaps that move the duck along, or the little web feet, or rocket boosters.
Yeah.
The Build Back Better is almost like a mega hat, only different.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm struck by. I think that's kind of curious that both of these are hearkening back to better times.
Yep.
And I go, that's complicated.
Yeah. Just BBB right across the slogan, the bill of the cap, or whatever the head part.
The Better Business Bureau.
Yeah, but
what another thing I love about this sentence, and we don't have it in the diagram, but it is in the original sentence, is that it starts with the word "but." Thanks. We can see it at the bottom there. So this sentence starts with the word "but," which is kind of a grammatical no. I mean, if you're being prescriptive about it, but it is. I find it so rhetorically effective, because it's a sentence that's already kind of pivoting. It's already it's implying something that it means to contrast or negate. So it has it becomes a sentence that's already always in motion. It's very cool that way.
What I love too about the comparison between these two sentences is coming from two bodies that were committee. These are sentences being built and compiled by groups of people, not one individual author. It shows the ability of those groups to come together to find this nuance and this parsing of intention and meaning beyond just basic and simple us versus them.
Yeah, this is a lot less polarizing.
And then you've got that use of the pronoun again, our American people, the economy, our economy, and the American people. Yeah, trying to unify. Yeah, I was thinking it was our American people. No, but still our economy. So that's that whole kind of building, kind of common ground, and the American people. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, good job, platform writers. Yeah, the but almost, I kept not wanting to put it on quite yet, because I didn't know where the sentence was going to go, whether I was going to run out of page or not. And I kept almost wanting to not make a line, not let the first stroke of the B get on the page, but just the two round humps come in, so that it seemed like it was already in progress. And then I went to look back into the platform. Probably, I expected that when I'd taken it out of there, it had come from the middle of a paragraph. but it's a paragraph on its own. This phrase that starts with, this sentence that starts with, you know, hey, and let me remind you what I just said. The third piece of, I mean, we've got about 15 minutes left before the hour. We could go to a third sentence if everybody wants, or you want to head on to a tweet. The third sentence is the Equal Rights Amendment. So we would be bringing in women. What do you think, you guys? Want to see the Equal Rights Amendment diagram?
Yeah, just so we save room to talk about tweets a little bit at the end.
Okay, yeah, let's save the tweets for later. Hosty, do you have sentence 3? So that's the Equal Rights Amendment that now people have been bringing back, thinking that it might be a good idea to allow this to be ratified now that 37 states have actually passed to ratify it. It's kind of the opposite of the bullet feeling. It's you know, a little more tail heavy in a nice symmetrical way.
Yeah, for me, it's very powerful because we have this very simple equality shall not be on the left. And then on the right, there's this really definition of what equality shall not be. So it's really powerful to see like the simplicity on the left and how we kind of articulate that in this complex system on the right.
It's kind of like a pitchfork of layered density on the coming across.
That's an interesting point, Joel. I think it's fascinating because this is intentionally a passive voice, right? Equality shall not be abridged, rather than the active version, which would be the United States or any state shall not abridge equality. And I think that is creating sort of that fanning out effect, I think, a little bit, because passive sentences are always a little bit thornier.
But that's a great point, though. I mean, because we're almost respecting equality more by keeping it primary as the subject than the United States. The United States and our laws are subservient to even our notion of equality. I think that's what this is saying by putting equality as the subject, which I'm all about.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the volume is on the right, but in many ways, the weight is the single word on the left.
Yeah, and these little prepositions too, how we link stuff is really interesting. By carries a lot of weight when you look at it this way. It gives a lot of who's going to have to be responsible for this. Anything else on this one? Any other pictures that come to mind? Well, maybe scarecrowy.
I just see the depth as we move towards social justice. We keep, the burden is to enumerate all of the places, because it seems so hard for so many to understand just the complexity and depth and sufficiency of a word like equality. And so I'm grateful that, but that you see, right, the need to clarify that everything has to be assigned, otherwise no one will understand what you're talking about.
You know, and I wrote the word sex, and then it's followed by a period, which is quite nice in that it's such an easy, it's a really simple way to say this. 3-letter word. It's pretty nice that how we differentiated that. It was more complicated to say who's going to have to be sure not to abridge. our definition of who should be equal is just really simple.
And that's a thought I had. I love looking at these diagrams because they do make it seem so simple. But then I think about the arguments that the Supreme Court had around this word sex, and the complexities. And I think this typifies like my love-hate relationship with sentence diagramming. Is it makes me go, language is so simple. Look, I can put it in this little diagram and it's understandable. But then I go, but wait, different people have very different understandings of like this little word sex or what equality means. So I'm coming at this with that both and kind of perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. While I was saying simple, I was wondering if that was what I really meant to say. It's great. It's just 3 letters. I love that.
I find it interesting on the word sex here, how nestled it is, even though this is in many ways, this is the issue. And I think diagramming in this way, it calls so much attention to the phrase on account of, and how strange it is. And by breaking it into its component parts, it becomes somehow even more mystifying. On account of sex, I understand what that means, but when I look at it like this, it's so odd a phrase. What does it mean to be on account of something? So I'm really interested in all of this nestling language that I think we see in a lot of legalese, right? And especially here.
Oh, yeah, that is good. Lots of nesting. And the next they have to say state. Sorry, go ahead. Somebody else.
She's bringing up your.
Did somebody else have something else to say? All right. After doing all these, I started thinking about how does social media, any kind of modern methods of communication, how do they either help us or hinder us in communicating complicated meaning like we've just been talking about in these previous sentences? Even headline writing, how does it help or hurt us trying to understand? And so then I diagrammed one of the president's tweets. This is from May, right after the George Floyd, the protests start. And so that's tweet, I think that's tweet 1, Hosty. Yeah. And the odd part about this is the first sentence, the statement. There's a subject, but no nothing behind it. This is the subject. And then what? We know what the guy knows how to say. Well, I think this is joined by this is the main, this is the first assertion, is any difficulty. What?
Well, I think that's an understood if there is any difficulty. I don't that. Yeah, that's the whole point. It's not an eloquent way of speaking.
Yeah.
And that's also the burden of Twitter and why it's not maybe the best place or forum for anyone with any sense of mastery of language to attempt to communicate. Partially because you're limited to characters and are forced then to be editing and cutting off the beginning or the end of your sentences just to stay within your limits. And I would say that I'm trying to maybe say that in defense of the president, but then the reality is He's also someone who's not embarrassed to do a 3-tweet message that then went into the second, into the third. So,
well, yeah, and any difficulty, I mean,
I think it also shows, that form of speech is so raw that any difficulty, the fact that you're looking for and wondering who the reference is to, it almost speaks volume to the world that we're living in, where everyone's looking for someone to blame but can't quite put their finger on who they want to blame. So this captures that we are all looking for our villain while playing the victim. So that little blank is you.
But I also think Trump has done a masterful job of making a mess of Twitter. I think, I don't know, it gives me anxiety. Like when I'm faced with the proposition of diagramming Trump's tweets, like I start to sweat. This sounds like a special form of cruel punishment, because grammar is certainly not a strong suit. And yet what drives me crazy is that it somehow seems to be working for his demographic. There's a way that this makes sense in the worst way possible.
well, right, yeah, we will assume control. He can definitely say that sentence in full, and yet any difficulty occurs,
Well,
happens to me.
The known, or the implied known, without saying it.
Wow.
Well, and Trump loves to do that too. He loves to say, lots of people are saying, he likes to use this rhetorical kind of ploy where he raises suspicion, or he leaves like, oh, there's those bad people out there, right? But he won't name what it is. And I think that's, again, what he's doing here. And I don't think he does this intentionally. I won't give him that kind of savvy with language. But he does like to kind of create these absences rhetorically and then let his followers kind of fill in the worst possible scenario.
But it creates credibility, because if you filled in the blanks, it's the most believable set of facts or scenario that makes you satisfied and happy, and you're pretty loyal when you get to make up your own, finish the sentence.
Well, and you can't keep him accountable, right? He didn't say anything technically. It's, well, people have said, right? It's kind
My
of
slide 11 is a complete sentence by Trump in a tweet, but it just looks like a sentence that a middle school boy would say to another boy. My slide 11 says, it was under this thing of the 10 most obscene tweets by Trump, I think is what they called it. I don't know if you can bring it up. Yeah. No. Oh, wait. I think it's slide 11, unless you renumber. It's the one, what do we lose? The one that says tweets, when tweets are a substitute for eloquence. Oh, maybe you changed the numbers back. Anyway, yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's the complete sentence that you could diagram, but it sounds like a middle school boy. Truly weird, Senator Rand Paul.
My God.
Yeah, the middle school boy insulting another middle school boy.
Oh yeah, that would be easy to diagram, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this, I think the other one is the one we've been talking, that we were looking at, the looting and the shooting.
Yeah, sure.
The rhyming of it, then it makes it playful, like that's okay. Go ahead, get your guns, every 16-year-old kid, and get out there on the streets, because I mean, it just doesn't, the rhyming sounds like almost jump rope.
And who's the we?
Oh, good question. It's the same people that might be caused difficulty. Any difficulty for us. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, for us, from you, whatever.
Well, and the tweets are kind of like language, because when you're diagramming spoken word, it's a little different than written word, because there's gestures, there's things that are implied in spoken language, and I think some of that shows up in tweets.
The tweets sound like more like like something that you'd spurt out to the other middle school boy. Yeah, it's
little sound bites.
Sound bites, yeah. You're not really trying to get across information like they were in the platforms.
Mm-mm.
But it's almost like if someone's giving a speech and they wink, that's something that's not going to be written down, and you're not going to hear it. But the way they delivered it, there's a visual that goes along with it, create a different kind of meaning from when they speak.
It's definitely memorable, though, that whole thread.
Yeah.
I think it's plagiarized. I don't think he came up with shooting starts himself.
I think they said that in '68 in Chicago.
Probably.
Uh,
Yeah, probably.
I think, yeah, I think it was, I think somebody said that, perhaps the mayor.
To think that Trump came up with America First would also be a stretch.
Yeah.
I've been using that one for a long time.
So great. We've gone about an hour. So does anybody have a last thing to say? Some other insight in this whole process we've done? I want to just kind of give everybody a last word.
I would be remiss if I didn't give people a little bit more information about the course ModPo that I'm a teaching assistant for. Hasti, if you could bring up my screen for just my shared screen, thank you. So this is the website for the class Modern Contemporary American Poetry. It's offered through Coursera. Quite easy to find. It's free. It runs for 10 weeks, but there's also a kind of off-season version. All the information is there for anybody who's interested. That was just a quick little plug I wanted to get in under the wire. Thanks, Hasti.
Yeah, and it's been great during this pandemic to have 30 or 50,000 people to talk about poetry and American literature with.
Yes, especially now more than ever. It's really gratifying.
So,
on my account, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me. I think I'm challenged to think of new and different and maybe some unorthodox ways of diagramming language, almost as what would it look like if I made my own system? What rules would I come up with, and what kind of visual patterns could I develop? So thank you. It's kind of reignited my interest in this space again.
Yeah, I've been thinking pretty hard about that too. I probably took a few liberties. Did I, Susan?
A few. But I think, again, how can we make diagramming more dynamic and less static? It's kind of an important way to look at it.
Okay.
That is, yeah, that's a cool way to think of it for sure, because it's sort of this grade school exercise that I think people lose interest in, but it is, yeah, it's really dynamic. And some of the color coded ones that were shown on the screen earlier, I mean, that's so cool too. Like you can go forever color coding the various parts of speech, depending on what you want to trace across a sentence or various sentences.
And different kind of ways of, like italics, bold, just ways of typography too.
Yeah.
Language, of course, continues to evolve, and of course, technology is going to influence that in a significant way. And so much of it, when we get into mediums where you're either forced into shorter spurts of language or even shorter attention spans, so much will become implied. And as more and more becomes implied, it'll be interesting. Joel, you might very well need to come up with a new system then to diagram because of how the structure of language itself is going to change. AI, just to talk about that, where computers are now coming into the fold, creating their own language as a tool of translation, that same phenomenon will continue to develop and evolve in the backside of technology outside of human control, but will still interact with it in a meaningful way and looking for either implied or intended meaning. And so I think it's complex now. It's going to even get more complex.
Yeah, and we in ModPo we talk a lot about open poems so that they have various meanings. But if I'm reading the platform or a law, I don't really want open meaning. And if well,
then stop reading the law, because my understanding is it's intended to be based upon interpretation. So
yeah, interpretation, but there should be what's in and what's out. in a lot of ways. We should be able to at least clarify it and write new language that does explain it. I mean, and that's certainly writing that's explanatory is far different than art. But if we keep letting, like the president, for one thing, to make a statement that is complete, who's going to take control, and when? He doesn't even have to justify what difficulty it is. It just amazes me that something like that can be said, and then there's no responsibility on the speaker. And I mean, we've seen that for the last 4 years. So sorry.
That's where the language is going, like Chris said.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Go back to the Republican platform. That's what I said. It's originally written and meant as a critique at one moment in history, but they didn't update it. So does it stand still as a critique of the prior administration, or does it now stand as a, hey, look at us, we're taking accountability, or accepting the blame, or showing our ability to evolve with the time? I don't know, but it's just striking because that language about our place in the world, the subject was clear when it was written in 26. It's President Obama, but who's the subject of that sentence now?
Yeah.
Self-reflection and self-critical. Was it foreshadowing then in that case in 2016 of what they knew was coming?
And go ahead. Sorry, Susan.
I'm sorry. No, I think it's not like we did it. It's more like it happened. You know how people do that where they don't accept blame? Yeah, it happened, not we did it. So first it was Obama, now it happened.
Yeah, that's good. I don't know if we had any questions or anything like that. Do we have any in the chat? Is there anything else that we should address?
Nope.
You're muted.
No questions, but I think this is a really wonderful place to end this conversation. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Max and Joel and Susan and Chris for participating in this panel. And thank you so much to Terry and Steuart for bringing everyone together and putting together this program. And thank you again to our audience for joining us for the last of our open source programs. And we'll see you in Open Citizenship. Bye, y'all.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.